Recording this. Beautiful. We're recording. We're getting started. Um, Everybody, I just want to say formally, now that we've started recording. Thank you so much for joining in this Zoom class. I love doing these things because I love sharing, the things that I figured out on mandolin. Um, the subject for the class. Oh, and of course, we do have Jason Annett coming in for the second half, which will be really awesome, and I'll be asking him questions and stuff. Uh, the subject of today's workshop is going to be scales, important scales and arpeggios and shapes that I think about when I play jazz tunes. And, we're specifically going to look at the tune All of Me. But this is definitely going to apply to anything. If you have a question about any kind of like song, or even if it's a different chord change that I'm not necessarily covering, but if it's in that realm, please, any questions you guys feel free to put in the chat box, and we'll touch on those. I wanted to, before I really like get into the nuts and bolts and talking about the actual scales, and we just talk about the notes. Um, I wanted to give, say something to kind of set a tone for, what I think your expectations could be out of something like this. Kind of the headspace that I think would be, beneficial. I think that you shouldn't worry about trying to learn everything that is said in today's, you know, if I'm talking about scales or different arpeggios, I'm going to try to slow it down so you can learn as much as possible. And then you can go back and rewatch anything if I said something a little too fast and you want to hear it again. But basically, I'm trying to point you in the right direction. And I also want to give you these really cool things, that actual concrete things that I do play that you can use. But it would be hard in a couple hours to just explain everything or to learn everything that I'm throwing out there. So if I mention some things, I'll try to point it out, like, hey, this is something that, don't worry about learning this note for note right now, but write down what this is called and you can look it up. It's easy. If you don't know what the harmonic major scale is, you can look that up and you can see it very easily on Google, and you can find, oh, it's written out. It's, there it is. Um, so I'm trying to get you pointed in the right direction, and then with the materials and the things that I do tell you talk to you about, you have something to work on and continue to study. And I'm always studying, and some of these concepts and some of the things that kind of on the outer limits of what I work on, or what I've kind of developed. I'm always working on them, and I always go back to new ways to think about certain topics and certain things. So, but like I said, I do want to show you guys some concrete things, some cool things that will inspire you, hopefully, and hoping that a lot of light bulbs are going to be going off in your heads as we, talk about these jazz concepts. I do encourage you to take notes. Definitely, if you want to, I hope everybody's muted and you can be, um, trying things out as I'm saying, and I'm going to be trying to say, oh, I'm on this fret, I'm on this note, on this string. But please take notes. Or maybe if you want to rewatch later and take notes, I think that's going to be really helpful, because I mean, I know you guys have all probably taken a class before, but just I'll try to point out the things that I think are worth writing down, that you could revisit and just kind of have something to really concretely remember and something to guide your practicing moving forward. Um, okay, so that's kind of like the housekeeping, as it were. We did get started late, so I'm definitely going to be going a little past what the original schedule was, and we'll probably end up finishing like about 10 minutes past the end time. So before we talk about the actual notes and the scales that I'm going to show you, um, I wanted to mention a couple kind of concepts, kind of global things that can help you organize, like why I chose to talk about this specific topic. Why are we looking at scales, and then why are we going to look at these specific shapes? As far as like why is that the approach that's going to make you better at playing like All of Me? So whenever you're working on any kind of music and you're taking music lessons, you can work on, you know, harmony and rhythm, kind of two big categories. Harmony being the scales, the notes that you're choosing to play, that you have a vocabulary. Inherently, everybody's got their vocabulary. Some people have a smaller vocabulary, some people have more extensive musical vocabulary, and that kind of translates into shapes and note combinations that you know how to do. Um, so that's what we're going to be dissecting, is really kind of expanding your vocabulary, and as far as jazz harmony goes. I think rhythm is obviously, it's like the other pillar, of if the other huge part of music, that they're both happening simultaneously when you're making music. Rhythm can be a little harder to teach, and it's just not really the direction I was going to go today. I think rhythm, it can be hard to teach because it's also the easier thing to learn just from listening. I think inherently you can listen to somebody playing and get a feel for the rhythm, but then you're like, well, what notes are you playing? And that's kind of the difficulty, is figuring out, but what notes do I do to play that rhythm, if that makes sense. Um, so uh, I think that really, that people always talk about listening being such an important aspect to learning and getting better. That's totally right. And I think that a large part, like when I was coming from bluegrass, kind of in my teen years, kind of around, I was almost in my 20s at that point, when I was like really falling in love even more deeply with jazz. The rhythmic aspect, nobody really could teach me that, like how to swing or even how to play Latin music, which happened kind of more in my 20s. That's really hard to teach. I mean, you can study some concrete rhythms and then try to replicate those and get those in your hands, but largely it's like, okay, that rhythm is just two bars, that somebody can tell you that, and then it's still, you're the one who has to internalize that. And I think listening to music is really what helps internalize and kind of make that part of like your dialect or your accent that you play with. So a lot of us might be coming from like a folk or bluegrass background, and I just encourage you, if you like jazz, I can point you in the direction of some different guitar players, people who really inspire me. If you find somebody you like to listen to, that's really what it's all about. And then by listening to them, and you kind of just absorb those rhythms. But then, like when you're listening to a guitar player and you're thinking, when people are playing fast, it is hard to figure out what notes. And I think that's what's on everybody's mind, is like, oh, I want to know that note combination, how to play through jazz chords. Um, so okay, so that's what we're going to be talking about: harmony, right? Scales and shapes. So within harmony, and for the purposes of what we're going to be looking at, I would say that there are kind of two categories of styles of phrases. Phrasing is what it's all about. That's what a lick, some people call it a lick or a riff or a phrase. It's just a sequence of notes, right, that has a rhythm. But really, so if I'm going to put these in two categories, where you have one that's a simpler phrase that really just grooves harder. And like an example of that might be like if I'm playing like All of Me, like so I'm not really doing really notey things. I'm playing a little, like a simple phrase that's very rhythmic. And we're not going to, again, that kind of falls in that, it's leaning towards that category of more rhythmic ideas. So what I really want to get to, the nuts and bolts of, like, so the other category of harmonic ideas is the really notey stuff. So consecutive eighth notes and some triplets and some complex lines that use these shapes and different scales that are kind of hard to unpack, and that's what we're going to dissect. So an example might be like, so the faster runs, it's kind of flashy, but it's like there's so much. You can play fast lines and not say very much, but that's the players that I like to listen to. They do have a lot to say, even with those fast lines. There's like a lot of information in there. So that's kind of what I'm trying to dissect today. um so that being said, um we're going to work on expanding our vocabulary and how to play some of these kind of harmonically complex phrases. So now we are going to really start talking about, um, enough with the prefacing everything and, like, the kind of abstract, like, here's what we're going to be talking about. Let's talk about it. So the first thing we're going to look at are scales and arpeggios. So if you're taking notes, or if you want to go listen back later and write these things down, this is worthy of writing down. I think that we're in the key of C, when especially, we're looking at the tune All of Me today. You should be focused on, if you're coming from a background where you're already playing music, but you just want to get better at playing jazz and kind of developing that jazz idiom. When you're playing in a major key, you need to be thinking like your whole mentality, or the harmonic palette there, is a major seven chord. And if you don't know what a major seven chord is, that's worthy of looking up and really figuring out. So there's a difference between the dominant seven and the major seven. This might sound kind of remedial, so I'll just try to quickly move through this, and then we can look at some more advanced things. But the major seven sound, when I'm in the key of C, I instead of playing a C on top, like if I'm playing a chord, I prefer this B. So I'm just playing like a regular good old bluegrass chord and then putting a B on top. Like the highest note is a B. And then if I play a C chord here, it has a B major there. So when I'm just playing like riffing, kind of vamping over, just playing some lines over C, it has that sound with it. So I'm preferring that note. I'm kind of using that note more often. There's other things I do in here too. I'm using arpeggios. So if I take any scale, or a chord is basically when, a chord can come from a scale, or it depends on how you look at it. But an arpeggio is when you take a scale which has 8 notes from one octave to the next octave, and you take the first, third, fifth, and then if it's a seventh, as in jazz, oftentimes there's seventh chords. So this one's a major seven, which means that like a C major seven has that B. So you got the 1, 3, 5, and major seven. So when I'm playing lines, oftentimes whatever chord I'm playing on, I'm arpeggiating specifically those notes. And by picking those notes, that's what makes it sound like the chord that I'm playing over. So C major seven, you can hear I'm using some passing notes, but oftentimes there's these fragments. We're going to look at this in the transcription of the solo on All of Me, but there are these sequences of notes, these clusters of notes that are just arpeggios. So for instance, if I just play C, I go up to the D as well. So we've got the major third, fifth, major seventh, and then I go up to that 9. And that brings me to another idea that's really common in all of this jazz phrasing, which is enclosure. So if I have a note, let's say that the C is a main note that's happening with this phrasing, or I mean, that's the scale I'm playing on, right? So I can enclose that note with a note before it and a note after it. And it doesn't have to be like one fret exactly half step up below, half step above. It doesn't have to be chromatic in that sense. Like this is the that D note is a whole step above C, but you can see how the phrasing. So I basically surrounded that note that I ended up landing on. And you can do that with different notes in the arpeggio. So now I'm kind of exaggerating it. It sounds kind of funny when that's the only thing you're doing is just the enclosing every note. But definitely, it's a musical idea that works. I mean, there's a lot happening there, but that idea happens all the time with just jazz phrases, right? So major seven is definitely worth basically figuring out how to make it sound like you're playing over a major seven chord. So C major seven, as opposed to just like C, regular old C. Because when you're playing like in a bluegrass context, the kind of more modern sounding bluegrass tends to have that major seven sound, but oftentimes it's a little bit more like pentatonic, uh, which you know I didn't include any B note there. So that major seven sound is much. It's definitely like a lush, pretty sound, and that's kind of like our harmonic palette for just when we're playing in a major key. Okay, so in when you're in a major key, and oftentimes like this chord just comes up anyway, because even in a lot of times in jazz tunes, it's jumping around to these different places, right? It's pretty harmonically complex. It's not just staying in C the whole time and go 1 4 5. I mean, it goes to like all these different places. So a really important thing that you need to know, another thing to write down, would be the the relative minor of the key of C is A minor. We can use different A minor scales all the time when we're playing it. It doesn't have to just be when the song goes to A minor. We can be playing over different A minor scales just when we're on the key in the key of C, for instance. Um, One that's really important to study would be the A harmonic minor. You've got the harmonic minor and the melodic minor, really important sounds. Uh, for instance, harmonic minor would be if I have a minor scale. So let's say I'm starting out on A, playing minor, so it's got the C natural. Then I'm going to play F natural, so it's a natural 6. And then I'm got a pretty big jump there from F to G sharp. That's the major 7. And then I've got A again. So this sound really is akin to like that jump from F to G sharp is kind of, it's really like a diminished interval. So the diminished sound kind of comes into play. So we can look at that when we really look at all of me. We'll maybe talk about like how you can add in some of maybe a diminished sound. But just as a scale, like this is so useful. Like if I'm just playing over A minor, it's very gypsy sounding. That, but if I'm playing, so basically the what I want to point out here is that the if I were to play just like an A natural minor, like a regular old A minor, the note that's different is that G note, right? It's not a G sharp. It doesn't have that major 7 sound. It's got, so a regular old A minor would be like, so that being a natural minor, those are all just notes from the C scale, right? So that's not really saying anything special. And I'm saying, oh, you can play an A minor over C. I mean, yeah, because it's just all the same notes. So now by bringing in this harmony like A harmonic minor, we're changing a note. So that note is that G sharp note. If you were going to put that in terms of C, there's a scale that I really didn't learn about until recently. Probably, I mean, a couple years ago or something. Just the terminology, but you can call that harmonic major. So now, if we're looking at the back to our home key, the relative major of A minor, if we were to have that same note combination, like that, those same notes, right? It's that G sharp note that we're changing. So if you take a regular C scale, so I'm just gonna start here on the G string. I'm gonna play this. Basically, the harmonic major scale is like this. So when I got to G, I went to that G sharp, and then I went to a B and a C. That scale is really helpful. And really, I mean, all we're really doing, we're not playing an A. So a lot of times, like I do include an A as well. The key point there is that we're adding in this new note that's got a G sharp. So that note is so important to jazz. I don't mean like just like G sharp. What I mean is the sharp 5 or that flat 6 in any key that you're playing in, because that note gives you basically all of these swing chord changes, like the jazz chord changes. Not all of them. I mean, but let me give you some examples. The 5 chord, which is like the one of the most important chords in any style of music. I mean, going from a 1 to a 5, the epitome of that, uh, you know, tension and release. Um, if we now have our G7 chord with that note, we're adding in a G sharp, that makes it a G7 with a flat 9. So there, I add that. I'm playing that G sharp note right there. That shape, just like that, that's the same shape as a diminished shape. I'm playing a B, an F, so third fret, second, no, I'm sorry, fourth fret, third fret, fifth fret, and fourth fret again. And then to kind of resolve it, I just did a G on top again. But that sound, oh, here's another way you can play that voicing. Like you can take that, another really standard dominant shape is when you play, for instance, with my second finger, I'll play an F on the third fret, B on the second fret, and then third fret again with third finger. And I can get, that's just a really standard dominant shape. I could play, when I'm in the key of C, playing the G7 as the 5 chord, I can have that open G, which sounds beautiful. Now, if I raise that top note, so that's that flat 9 sound. Why is it a flat 9? Because if you played a G9, the A is like the 9 of, if you're looking specifically at a G scale, it counts all the way up to 8. And then when we get to that high G, that's the octave, that's number 8. And you go one note past that, that's the 9, right? So, but if I make that 9th flat, they call that a G flat 9, a G7 flat 9. And again, that sound, you can bring in the diminished sound. That's why that diminished shape works so well, because basically if I play the diminished arpeggio, for instance, resolving on C there, that diminished, if literally playing the diminished there, kind of encompasses the G with a flat 9 sound. Now, we can talk about this in a little bit when we specifically look at All of Me, but that sound, like I don't play the diminished arpeggio as much when I'm going for like a 7th chord with a flat 9 sound, because it really just sounds like you're playing a diminished. It is what it is. It works, but because it's got that special note and it's got the other notes from that 7th chord arpeggio, but the structure of what you're playing just sounds like you're playing a diminished arpeggio, because that's exactly what you're doing. So for instance, if you're playing like a G7 with that flat 9 sound, I can use maybe that enclosure. So I'm enclosing the G note now with that flat 9. So there I'm just taking that arpeggio all the way down. And I have some passing notes, so it's a little bit more like a scale, not as much like an arpeggio, because I threw in a C note there. But so that's one example where that one note, which we were talking about this C harmonic major, right? The scale idea, which brings in the G sharp note. So that's one example where that G sharp note is like a super great jazz sound. Well, All of Me, when it starts out with a C chord, and then the first chord change, it goes to an E7. The key note that makes it sound like it goes to an E7 is the G sharp note. It's the same note. So I did a little trickery there. All I did was I just took this C chord and then raised the G to a G sharp. And that's actually just like an augmented shape. But the trick is, it's not only a C augmented, but since that augmented shape is a repeating pattern, it's a repeating interval, that there's several other chords that are going to share the exact same notes and be augmented. That's also an E augmented. So any note in that, it could be C, E augmented. It could be that G sharp augmented. Just those three, right? All I'm doing is right there. I don't even know why I'm doing it. I mean, it's just because it's relevant, but we're getting off track a little bit. That's an augmented arpeggio. So I'm just playing C, and then I go up a major third, and then I go up a major third again to it. So C, E, G sharp, and then by the time I do that again, I'm already at C again. So uh, this sound, which is like really useful in jazz, but also kind of pop music. Like there's a lot of songs from the '60s and stuff that would use this. So like check this. I'm just gonna take this C chord. How many songs do that? I mean, just a million and a half. You got C chord, raise it up the augmented, and then raise it up once more. I just made that G sharp an A, and then I came back down. This is a cool move, but it's very relevant because uh, that's that harmonic major sound, which can work for so many different things. So all of me. So you'll see when we look at the solo that basically I go to that G sharp note, which is the major third of that E7 chord, like right at the exact time that it needs to sound like you're going to an E7. So any line you're playing, and then we'll talk about the E7 as well, like exactly what I'm doing over that. Basically, I'm just playing an E7 with a flat nine. We already looked at that as like a G7 with a flat nine. Basically the same thing, just over an E7 with a flat nine. And the flat nine note, which would be like our hard note to figure out, that's just an F. The thing is, when you start in jazz, like sometimes it's to arrive at that cool sound, it you kind of have to figure out like what that cool note is. Sometimes it's almost like the kind of the more farther away the chord change gets, oftentimes it's like it's a little subversive or kind of like it's hidden there, like what the notes that you're actually changing. Like when you go from a C major 7 to an E7, you really like, as far as like playing lines, you only really need to add in that G sharp note into what you're doing, because all the other notes, like you could continue to play a C note. That's just the augmented of a C. So I'm sorry, of an E7. It's because you could have that E7 with a C. All those notes I just played, it's like a C scale, but I'm adding in the G sharp, and it's working over this E7 like with a flat nine, because it's got that F note. The F is in the C scale. That could be anything, but in this context of E7, that G sharp makes it sound like I'm doing that E7, and I maybe have an augmented, maybe I have the flat nine. So we've got the G7 with a flat nine, E7, so it's the dominant third, the three dominant, I would call it. Um, Another really important change is the four minor. So oftentimes the song will go to a four chord and then it goes to a four minor, kind of resolving back to the one. So maybe like in All of Me, that G sharp note is the note that's really the only one that's really changing. What happens, I mean, like when you go to an F chord, that is made up of the notes of C, but you're emphasizing the notes, like you're using the F major arpeggio. That's, I mean, when we play over a different chord, we're not simply just playing the notes of a C scale. We have to, kind of structure our lines where we're making it sound like the arpeggio notes are falling on the beat in a way that basically that's your ear identifies it as that you hear the arpeggio, right? But I'm just pointing out that, so going from an F major, which is all the notes are coming from a C scale, When it goes to an F minor, that minor third is the same note. It's a G sharp. Here's another example. Uh, in All of Me, or basically in tons of swing tunes, you have like a very common chord change. Like this, the 2-5-1 move is like D minor 7 to G7. Before that, oftentimes you have it go to a 2 dominant. So in this case, D7 with and a really awesome jazz sound. It's really prevalent. It's just like a really common sound when you play D7 would be you do basically D7 and then you add that G sharp note to it, and they call that G sharp. Or I'm sorry, D7 sharp 11. For instance, if you play something like Take the A Train, that's the change that happens right off the bat. C. So I'm playing that G sharp note, that really cool note, over a D7. But that's the change. And they call it sharp 11 because the 11th, like if you're looking at a D scale and you count all the way up to 11, that's a G. Because you're going past it's on top of the chord. So you're going past the first 8 notes, count all the way up to 11. That's the fourth that's above that in the second octave. That's an 11. And then we're making that sharp. So this voicing is really cool. Basically, I'm taking this, this really common shape for a D7. We looked at it here when we did a G7, but now I'm just moving it here. So you've got it on the 5th fret with your 2nd finger on a C, 4th fret with 1st finger on an F sharp, 3rd finger's on D on the 5th fret. Now, what I do is I raise that 3rd finger I use my 4th finger instead to grab an E note. And so that makes it a D9. Anytime you say a 9 chord, that's assuming that it's a dominant chord that has a 9 added to it. Now, what I do, this is kind of a harder move, but it feels comfortable in my hand. I just think that it's hard, like people don't really know about it because it's kind of the next step. I'm barring with my 1st finger because my 1st finger is supposed to be playing the F sharp note, the 2nd note right there. Now, if I bar with my 1st finger, I can bar all the way across and get that G sharp. So now let me show you let me bring this back to something we've already talked about. We were talking about the C harmonic major, basically a C major scale that's adding in that G sharp note. The relative minor of that, A minor, A harmonic minor, because it's got that G sharp, right? That's what it would be if we're talking about A minor, is A harmonic minor. So another A minor scale would be, remember we've got this one. That's our harmonic minor because it's got the F natural and the G sharp and then an A. If we make that F sharp, it sounds like this. That's melodic minor, A melodic minor. It's super easy because all we're doing is starting with an A minor. And by the time you get up here on the E string, then it's like a major, finishing it off with like a major scale. That sound is similarly, it's super important in jazz and gypsy jazz and bebop. Not only like when you're playing in a minor key, can you use that as like your basic harmonic palette? That's very like a valid, like great sound you can use. But we can use that melodic minor scale as a substitution. In this case, on the D7, you can play A melodic minor. And the reason why that works is like all those same notes we were talking about, but the other important note to accommodate for it being a D7 is the F sharp note, because the D has an F sharp as the 3rd. So, for instance, and if I'm playing All of Me, when it goes to a D7 chord, that's really how I think about when I'm in a key like C major and it goes to a D7. That is what I'm go my go-to sound is the basically the sharp 11 sound. That's what you would call it because it's that like I'm playing over D7 and including that sharp 11 sound. But as far as playing through it, you can just think about playing over an A melodic minor. So maybe all I'm doing is playing the A melodic minor. This brings me to another point. So anytime you want to develop vocabulary, so if I tell you like, oh, here's the trick. If you're playing D7 and you really want to play an A melodic minor over that, you have to develop some kind of vocabulary. Like when you're practicing, how are you going to basically come up with new things to play that's using that scale? So a really great technique is that we talked earlier about kind of two styles of phrases. You've got real simple phrases that don't use very many notes, and then you've got really notey, complex phrases that's just like packed with notes. Like I'm doing some of those things. So it's one note after another. There's not a lot of breathing happening in there. When I'm soloing, I definitely like to take breaths and change it up, but it's basically you have these long stretches, these runs of passages of lots of notes. So to get to the point where you have that ability to just kind of make up those, just jump into a long run of notes. So an exercise that can help you build up that skill would be you're going to set an arbitrary tempo, and you can say it can be an arbitrary style of music. I mean, but we're in the context of like learning how to play something in jazz. So let's say it's like swing. Here's my rhythm I'm thinking about, and I've got a tempo. You know, my challenge to myself, the exercise is I'm going to say, when you start, try to play consecutive eighth notes, not nonstop eighth notes, using that scale for as long as you can until you mess up. If you mess up, it's okay. Just start over. It's like jump rope or something. You just it doesn't matter if you're not good and you mess up. You can start again and you're still getting the workout in. So just try to. I'm going to set this tempo, and oftentimes, I think when I was developing this stuff, it wasn't necessarily like me playing a swing groove or a swing rhythm, but a lot of times it was kind of a bluegrass context, or even if it's like faster swing music, it still has this kind of cadence where I'm not swinging as hard, but I'm just working on, because that's the other thing is like when you get good at it or you start to develop something, you can increase the tempo, and that's kind of the where you can take it with this exercise. But so I'm going to set this arbitrary tempo. I want to get really good at playing over D7. Well, which is really, I don't even need to think about playing D7. I want to get good at playing over this A melodic minor. So my exercise is to try freely improvising, going through the scale, and I'm looking for twists and turns that maybe I haven't played before, or maybe I have played it before. But let's say I get to a part of the neck. It's very functional too. It's like you can think about it. Oh, I'm in this part of the neck. Uh, I'm like working on this part of the neck, or that no, I need to move to another part of the neck. But basically, if I'm trying to consistently keep the eighth notes coming, you can go through a part of the neck or a little passage, and then maybe you didn't like what happened, or even if you did like what happened, challenge yourself to. Uh, oh, we have a comment here. Sorry, I'm just looking down here at the comments. I ever heard that called D7 flat 5. Yes, so D7 flat 5 is a very similar sound. It's technically different because that's assuming that the number being the flat 5 as opposed to a sharp 11 tells you where it's happening in the chord. So the flat five is basically not competing, or there's no other five happening. So, but a D7 with a sharp 11, that's saying that you're like adding that sound to the top. The flat five would be basically like I can also play. It's kind of arbitrary when I'm just showing you a mandolin chord that's got three notes, because if I show you this chord, that's how I like to play a D with a flat five. D, it's like D minor seven flat five, or it could be, yeah, just a regular old D7 with a flat five. Because there's not a lot of other notes happening, but that's the idea though, is that a flat five chord, it's happening like in the middle of the chord, so you're taking that fifth and dropping it down. Whereas with a sharp 11, you've got like a D7, then a 9, and then an 11. So you've got all those notes stacking up. And then when you get to that top one, you're raising that one. And that's why it has a little bit different, slightly different sound. So, but this exercise, let's just say like 1, 2, ready, go. I cheated. I actually threw in an F natural as opposed to an F sharp. But that's a very compatible sound. So basically, I went from playing an A melodic minor to an A harmonic minor, just very briefly. Um, when that happens, there's like the dichotomy, or kind of like the what I think of as like a yin yang tension and release that happens. Uh, Almost, I don't know, whatever analogy you prefer, almost like a seesaw. But basically, at one point you've got this tension and it kind of comes back here, then it goes, it's like a ball bouncing back and forth. um like when I play an A harmonic minor, those notes being F natural and then G sharp, that kind of creates that E7 with a flat 9 sound. Because if you were playing in the key of A minor and then had the harmonic minor, that is like what you're doing, that really sets you up if you're playing through those notes. So you're the whole time there's this tension and release happening, and that just kind of naturally happens because of the enclosure, the arpeggiating. Uh, but technically, what's happening there is like you've got that A minor, and then when you get these other notes that are in that scale, that's temporarily going to that fifth, that bouncing from the 1 5 1 5. That fifth is an E7 with a flat 9, because that flat 9 is that F note. It could very easily be looked at that way. But what I was talking about was this A melodic minor. So if you just practice when like when I'm riffing over this, I'm just looking for variations. I'm just trying to look for something that's more interesting. You can stumble upon things. When you hear somebody play something cool, it's great to figure out what they do, and that's listen to them and figure out what somebody else is playing, and that's like a really great way to add things to your vocabulary. But a lot of that exploring that just happens when you're messing around with your instrument, this exercise is really good because it's an arbitrary tempo, but it's a challenge. It's a challenge with the purpose of you're forcing yourself into an uncomfortable situation where you just have to look, you're grasping for these new note combinations that are going to work. And it's okay if it doesn't sound good. I mean, it's okay if you mess up. Like I said, just start over. But if it doesn't sound good, that's what it's all about. I mean, you're just exploring what those things sound like. So, again, like if I'm trying to get better at playing a melodic minor, 1 2 3 4. I messed up there. I put in a quarter note or something. But so then when you're playing All of Me and it comes to a D7 chord, like this trick could be used anywhere, right? So I think that's something you should work on. You should get better at really knowing your melodic minor scale, where you can just riff over it. Like kind of when you call a fiddle tune, you're like, hey, this one's in G, and you just have like stuff you do in G. You should have stuff you do when it's a melodic minor chord, because when you're playing something like all of these swing tunes, but all of me. Here's the thing. I'm actually really invoking some of this a melodic minor stuff when I go. Well, remember how I was just explaining that when I accidentally put in that F note, that was like a harmonic minor, right? Just one note different, which one, yeah, note difference between those scales. And when you've got that A harmonic minor and you're riffing over that, it kind of bounces back and forth that tension and release with an E7 with a flat nine. So when the first chord change that happens over all of me, you got C. You can think about playing over an E7 with a flat nine as playing through this A harmonic minor, and there's just a little tendency there. The thing that makes it not really an A minor, an A harmonic minor, and what really makes it playing over an E7 with a flat nine is basically where you're putting the emphasis, like where you're resolving to. It's all the same notes. That's like for the same reason that when you're playing in the key of C diatonically, it goes to a G7. All of those G7 notes are just from the C scale because it's just where you're putting the emphasis. You're just starting in a different part of the scale, and when it goes to the strong beat, you're putting the arpeggio notes of the one we're saying it is, or we want it to be, on the strong beat, and we're enclosing those notes. So that's a really important aspect of doing this. So you, like, when it goes to an E7, you don't have to think about just playing like an E7 arpeggio. You can think about it more kind of adding in some passing notes by calling it a scale. And the opposite is true. I mean, if you're thinking too much about it being a scale and you don't really like how that's sounding, maybe you need some more arpeggios in there, because the riffs and the phrasing is really just like a back and forth, this mix of scale, arpeggio, some passing notes. Like basically throwing in one passing note kind of makes it qualify as like a portion of the scale, right? And then, um, well, so, but what I was going to say was that, so the A harmonic minor is very useful, and then that uh, A melodic minor, when it goes to the D7, I'm just exploring the A melodic minor up the neck. I went up here all the way to an E, and the way I think about those positions when I do that kind of stuff, I'm just really going through the scale. I mean, maybe I'll like slide a finger here and there that you're not familiar with. I like to use, that's like a whole other conversation about shifting positions that I'm really, passionate about. Because I've developed this whole method of how I shift through different positions. But like when I go this high up the neck, I'm just thinking about that the same as how I would think about when I play an E here. See how I did the same thing? Um, what are some other important things? Okay, we've talked about kind of that first chord change in several different contexts, going to an E7, and it's got that really awesome note, the G sharp note. Well, the next chord change in All of Me, which is like really important as well, like all these chord changes are super common for jazz tunes. This tune goes to an A7. Now, A7, it doesn't have that special note we've been talking about for all these different types of changes, but um oh man, I feel like I should mention this because it's like it's gonna bug me if I leave this out, which I'm probably leaving out other things, so I don't know why this one thing is gonna bother me. But so that special note we were talking about, G sharp, we talked about how if you're on a D7, that would be like a D7 sharp 11. Okay, as per the comment here, what about a D7 flat 5? Yes, it's the same note. So when you have, like, how we talked about the G7 with a flat 9, When you make that a what they call a 2-5 move, like a 2 minor 5 1, typically if you just have like a 2 minor 5 1 move, those are all notes from your home key. If we're in the key of C, it's a D minor 7. Those are all notes from the C scale. It goes to G7, all still notes from the C scale. When we add in that special note, the G sharp, and so now when we go to our G7 and it's got that flat 9, whenever you bring in that sound a little bit earlier, like let's say you still break it up into a 2 minor 5 1, they call that a minor 2-5. So that's basically supposing that you're in the key of C minor, and it's the type of 2 minor 5 movement, 2 minor 5 1, that you would play like when it goes to a C minor. Because, well, I guess the reason is that that note, how should I say this? That's really what's happening when we play on the G7 and bring in the flat 9 sound. That's a substitution that's what you would do when you're playing in like C minor. All of those sounds like C, like so G7 with a flat 9 or maybe with a sharp 9, all I did was raise that flat 9 up a whole step. That move right there is so tasty. So you've got that G chord, and then I go get that flat 9 sound that we looked at. If I raise that up a whole step, it sounds kind of shocking just like by itself. That's a sharp 9 chord. And that is the type of sound that you would have like when you're in the key of C minor. So if we have a minor 2-5, meaning that now our D minor chord is going to incorporate that sound as well, that G sharp note. In this case, that would be a D minor 7 flat 5. And I like to play that. You can just play like a regular D minor 7 because we don't have a 5 in it. So there's not, it's not going to sound bad. You can just play that for your, when it's a minor 2-5 or just a regular D minor 7. It could be a flat 5 or no. But I like to add that in with that shape, basically changing my F to a G sharp. It's the same sound, it's the same note, but I'm just bringing it in to that sequence a little bit earlier, like adding it into the D minor chord. For instance, if you play Night and Day, like a really classic jazz tune, Night and Day, that's that first chord change right off the bat. Is that it's a D minor 7. If you're in the key of C, it's a D minor 7 flat 5. Some people play that as like A flat major 7, or you can even think about, I'm getting a little off track, but you can think about the D minor 7 flat 5 chord also as a 4 minor with a 6 in the bass. That 4 minor, we already talked about that 4 minor because it's got, like in All of Me, it's got that special note. It's like a 4 chord that then you add in that special note. So all of that is to say that it's just really similar sound, right? Okay, so where I was going to go with this was that we've talked about with that special note with G sharp, but in the tune All of Me, the next chord change after it goes C to E7, then to A7. That A7, all that same stuff is happening. Like the same way you would treat the E7 chord, that's how you can treat the A7 chord. I mean, relative to the being a new, like a different chord, but it's all the same type of stuff. You can think of the A7 as having a flat 9, right? So if you, for instance, if you arpeggiate your A7, like just an A7, so open A, C sharp on the 4th fret, open, G, then A. If I add in a B flat, that's the sound I'm talking about. Now, it's really cool, like doing that enclosure idea. I can add another B flat up here. and I'm enclosing the A, but using that B flat, so it's like an A flat. I'm sorry, an A7 with a flat nine. So when I think about playing over, like it's just any song, and then all of a sudden it's like a dominant chord. Typically, I can make that a flat nine sound. Sometimes that can kind of compete if it's already like a nine sound. I'm guessing like if the melody has a nine in it, so like as opposed to being an A7 with a flat nine, if it's like if an A7 with a B, that's a little bit like different sound. It's a little happier. I mean, it's just one note off, and it's a really common chord change for sure. Like you would be more likely to do that if the A7 were functioning as a two dominant chord. In this case, in the key of C, it's a six dominant. And typically, like all the time, like whenever it goes to a six dominant chord, feel free to just make that a flat nine. So I'm just doing that scale move. And the way I'm thinking about that is, you know, we're going to look at this here in a second. I do want to kind of move to some of the materials because I've got like a diagram thing I want to show you guys. Um, but when I'm thinking about like these lines, like how do I know where I am on the fretboard? I'm thinking about the same way that I would assume like any bluegrass player is gonna just navigate like wherever you are on the fretboard, like however comfortable you feel, like wherever you feel like you can play anything, you have to have like some kind of concept for where you are on the neck, right? And to me, those are the arpeggio notes. But maybe don't if that's like overwhelming to you, maybe you think about those as like double stop notes because that's kind of like how can you play anything if you don't know double stops? I mean, that's any key. Like if you just played like in like it could be a bluegrass tune or anything. If you're playing in the key of C, those are really just arpeggio notes, right? And so my concept for then taking that's because that's how I kind of think about the whole neck is like okay, then it goes to an A chord, and I'm like kind of thinking, okay, where's the next arpeggio? Because I don't really think about them as like I don't run that exercise all the time where I'm thinking, oh, I need to know the double stops like moving like that. It's just that I know, like I'd be more likely to think about it like this, just kind of playing the notes, kind of in a like a line, like a musical phrase. Now, when that's a dominant chord, then that's a little bit. I was just kind of playing major seven, but if it's a dominant chord, okay, so the way I'm like navigating things, I'm just thinking about all of those arpeggio notes as the notes I really land on. And even if I land on it for just a second, I can keep moving, but at any point I could land on any of it's like I could land on them, but also like as I mentioned earlier, those arpeggio notes or that's where I'm putting the emphasis like with the beat, and I'm not really playing to like a beat that you can hear that like oh I'm playing a song that's and there's the one, but you can hear that I'm playing over that chord change because it's just the inherent structure. Like any of these phrases, they kind of operate by the same rules. Like I'm playing the arpeggio and I'm enclosing the notes that are the arpeggio notes, like those really important notes. Um, so when you're playing over A and then you want to get that flat nine sound, you've got to grab that B flat. So that's a really great way to kind of think about like opening up to some of these licks, you know? So I can play an arpeggio, bring in that B flat. Ooh, I actually threw in a C natural, which is a great sound as well. So what I did was I started down here with an A. Now I'm gonna go up like add in a B flat, kind of arpeggiating. You can do a B flat on top, or what I did was a C and then B flat, and that sound is kind of what we mentioned. It's what we mentioned before when it was in the context of G7 with a sharp 9 and then flat 9. So if I've got that C sharp sound in there, there's C sharp. I can also make a C sharp on top there, at the top of that run. Or C natural. So now we've talked about like a lot of these things, but not really looking at the materials that I prepared for you guys. So I would like to look at those. Um, let me. I'm not going to bring it up on my computer because I'm going to look at it here. I'm going to try it this way, and I'm just going to kind of narrate where I am. But the first thing, I'm looking at this all of me solo, this transcription. The first 2 bars playing over C, what this is doing is just arpeggiating and then when it goes to E7 it goes to that G sharp note, right? That's a really important, like a really successful technique for navigating changes. You kind of have to know, that's what you have to know beforehand to make it sound successful. Is like if you know the changes, like I know it's going to go to E7, so what I need to know is how to make it sound like it's going to go to E7 right when it changes to E7, right? Because if you're it goes to a new chord and then you're kind of stumbling searching for the sound, that's the difference between sounding like you know what you're doing and like you're looking for it. So the first 2 bars here, I'm just keeping that in first position. This is the first shape I'll mention on the chord diagram, or I'm sorry, like the fretboard diagram page. Sorry to jump around, but on the fretboard diagram page, the first diagram is just showing this. Second fret, 5th fret, 2nd fret, 5th fret on both the D and the A strings. So that's very similar to like a C arpeggio, C major 7 arpeggio, but with the 9. Remember that was like the first kind of scale idea we started talking about. So that shape is really present in the first couple bars. Then, and I'll just mention just some of these other ideas that are present as well. We've got that enclosure because we're going up the arpeggio. Well, I don't know if I would call that enclosure. It's just like kind of gravitating around that C, but it's pretty explicitly. So then it goes to E7. So that whole phrase starts out on the G sharp note. That's our really identifying, identifiable note that makes it sound like E7. And then it's really like an E7 flat 9 because it has that F natural. That's the first note on the next bar, on the 4th bar. But we've got this. That's like arpeggiating. Brings in that flat 9 sound. This is using enclosure very chromatically. Then, as you can see, when it goes to A7, it's timed out exactly to where when it starts on the A7, it's going to a line that starts on the A note and arpeggiates that A7 with a flat 9 as well. See, that's also flat 9 because it's got the B flat. And that whole A7 run it's using enclosure, it's using those arpeggios, and then at times it has a passing note. But you can see then, as far as the phrasing goes, it's lined up so that as soon as it goes to D minor, it's landing on D minor. And I think that's part of what makes it sound the way it does. I mean, it's just it sounds like if we didn't have somebody playing along to the chord, the playing the chords for us, we would know what is happening, just like what changes we're playing over, because we're making it sound that way with our single notes. So putting those important notes, those identifiable, like, the major third is one, and obviously the root of whatever chord you're going for. So those first couple lines, you can see when it goes to the D minor 7 and E7, that that couple bars there, that is kind of that style that I was mentioning, that you have to have a break to make it more musical. It's not going to be just constant eighth notes the whole time. So when it goes to D minor, I chose to not play something really notey, but something that kind of sits in the groove and just kind of brings it back to something that's like really just, grooves nicely. So you got this like, and then we're ready for like a little, we've taken a breath from that. And then we're ready for this next line. That bar number 10, there's that F note. That's that flat 9 sound. That you can do that like in a couple ways. You could play it in first position. So maybe uh or I think when I wrote this out, I was thinking about if you shift it up, because I do that move a lot where I'm going to shift up. So maybe I do bar 9 is like, and then for bar 10, I'm going up here where I've got my second finger on E. Well, there's like a pickup note, but then the third finger would be on F on the A string. Was that fret number 8 on bar 10? So then I'm committed. I mean, I'm in this part of the neck now. So that whole next two couple bars is like, let's see, this got kind of a jump move there. Something like that. So, but that's how I think about this stuff a lot. This shape is kind of what I was mentioning earlier, as far as how when I start getting out of first position, to me that's not very, I mean, this is just how I play, so it's like obviously it's not scary to me to like go up here and play what I'm doing. But like for you to develop that into how you can navigate the neck. I mean, what I'm thinking about when it goes through E7 there, you could just think about like a regular old E chord, right? So I mean this shape, but then if I'm arpeggiating that, that shape right there, that I'm playing G sharp with my first finger, ninth fret on B with my third finger, D on the fifth fret on A string, and getting that F note on the eighth fret. That type of phrase I do all the time, because I mean, it's like, it's so typical of the sound. It's got like, it's arpeggiating. It's got the note that makes it sound cool, the F natural note. I can do that in a couple different ways. I can fully arpeggiate up to the F, or I can kind of walk up, like put in the E as the passing note. Then I still use that enclosure technique at the end of that phrase. So I just brought the lick kind of coming down that arpeggio. See, and then I'm doing the same type of enclosure on that E on the G string. And then, so continuing on with this, like this mandolin solo here, the transcription, 11, 12. So bar 13, when it goes to D7, you see how it goes to that F sharp note right when it needs to be D7. That's a nice line to play over D7 because it's got so many things happening. This interval, which is like a D9 interval, looking at that shape, if I had like I think maybe bringing in kind of some. I don't know if I'm going to look at in great detail at the fretboard diagram page, just because of kind of like how we're working on the solo. But I think my point there was that how closely related, because you can study that, you can look at those shapes if you can decipher it. My point here is like how closely related these shapes really are, and like how that's how you could think about them as well. Because for me, it's like whenever I'm playing like in C and then it goes to the E7, I'm not jumping to like a whole different part of the neck to like where, oh, that's where I know how to play E7 is like up here. That's an E note. They're all the notes are really closely related. Remember we talked about, oh, then it goes to the E7 note. You're just adding in a G sharp. So from what you're doing, let's say on that fretboard diagram page, the third figure there is green. So we've got a G, a C, and an E. Just an arpeggio, right? You can make double stops. Well, if I raise the second finger to a G sharp, there's that augmented sound that works just fine over the E7. What if I lower that G to an F sharp? Those types of shapes, I use those all the time. So that's like a D7 with a 9. Maybe I kind of fill in some of the notes, F sharp, A, C, E. And to me, there's so much information there. You could play a simple lick. All I did was I just went from that F sharp, then down to an F. And by doing that, it's like an F major 7. That's perfect for D minor 7. So, like, when it goes to basically the end of the first half of the tune, or yeah, of the first half of All of Me, that's such a common change, going from the 2 dominant to a 2 minor 5 1. So that's the point of this fretboard diagram thing, is that we looked at those kind of those first 4, then the 5th one just right there, like right by it. I think you should challenge yourself, like as you're trying to familiarize yourself with how to play through the jazz vocabulary, being able to make those connections where like from one chord, if you're on one chord and it goes to a new chord change, being able to find what's the closest way to get there, right? And it's like most likely gonna be like 1 fret away. Or I mean, if it's not, I mean, maybe that's the thing. It's like all these types of chord changes. It's like sometimes you're changing 2 notes, but oftentimes you're just changing 1 note. Especially if you're just like in one part of the neck, just 1 note is going to make the difference. And that's what's happening there. Like the 5th diagram to the 6th diagram goes through like an E7 in that way. That's the 6th, was it 7th one? The bottom one. 8th one, this one. The 9th one is this one. 10th one. That's the same move we did earlier, just in a different part of the neck, where I'm just raising the G to a G sharp. Then the last 2, here's like where you're doing a C. and then right there, same position, I can just easily grab. So that method is really what I'm incorporating, like whenever I'm soloing. It's what's like the quickest, easiest way, because that's how you're navigating the chord changes to where when it's time for the next chord, you're right there, ready. Like you're already like identifying what's the closest note that I'm gonna hit when it goes to the new chord change that's gonna make it sound like I'm on the new chord. And that's the kind of the the result of that, or what that's what makes it sound cool, or like it just makes it all sound connected and coherent. Because if you just play like your C major 7 lick, and just every time it goes to a new chord change, you're like moving the same shape to a new part of the neck, that doesn't sound coherent. So maybe the method is like looking for all like from one thing, just barely moving like maybe a note or a couple notes, but like in the same position. Okay, so kind of returning back to the transcription, that D7 lick on, what was it, bar 13? 13. That's a great lick. You could just use that all the time. I mean, for, and if you find a lick like that that you think, oh, like, okay, that works really well, you can transpose that to different keys. And I didn't mention that that has that G sharp note in what's played there. So it's got that sharp 11 sound. So all of that works like that's a melodic minor language. Or let's see. And that's really cool because see how that type of phrasing, how it lands like sliding into that F sharp. Like I started on the F sharp. It's kind of like passing notes, but it's the outline of the structure is that like F sharp, A, C, E. So it's starting on that F sharp, it kind of dances around it, and then it comes back into it, slides into it, and hangs onto it for a second. Then when we go to the D minor 7, this is a great example of how when you play over like a D minor 7, you can think about that one as, oh, Jason's joined in. Oh, Jason, so we did have some technical difficulties earlier, so we're going to be like taking a break here in about 10 minutes. I'll have to explain. There was like, I think like 50 technical difficulties. For everybody had like a different reason why the Zoom link wasn't working. But so bar 15, when it goes to that D minor 7, you can think about that as like an F major 7, because, and that's what's written. I mean, that's what I'm playing here. So starting on that F, and then it goes up to an, that's very similar to what happens on the D7 bar on bar 13. But this one goes, that's just a great interval to, I mean, because it's like outlining the chord, it's arpeggiating. And see how that lasts for one bar, and it's arpeggiating, and then it's kind of walking down at the end. And that's a really good move that happens a lot. Like when I'm doing a 2 minor 5, so right when it goes to the G7, I've landed on the B note. Because as similar as those chords can be, the G7, the change there is like that it moves from this, having a B, right? So then when it goes to G7, it's landed on that B perfectly, and then it's arpeggiating. So, and then basically now we're on to the next half of the tune. Um, I could, I probably won't explain the rest of this. I want to open it up to, oh, he's got some numbers for it. The 3/9. We'll have to talk about that. Classic. Okay, so I want to hear some questions before we take a break. Like we'll break in a few minutes, and then we'll gear up for Jason's portion and all the questions I have for him. But anybody, some kind of question over the stuff I've talked about for the last hour and a half. You know, please type it in the chat box. I'll mention, so as the second half of this solo gets started, it's very similar. I think I did that intentionally. I mean, I wrote it so that it's starting out similarly to how the very beginning is, except it's just a little bit, it's like the same shape. Basically E, G, B, and D. But then it's got a little bit different rhythm, so it's a triplet. If time permits, can run the entire solo once. And is there an MP3 of the solo to work on? Okay, so I didn't record this solo. I just kind of made it up, like wrote it. But I think what I could do pretty easily, I think you might benefit from having the MIDI file, because the computer will just play it. But basically, the solo sounds. We'll see if I can do it. Two, one, two, three, four. Turn the page. Uh, so that last part, we've got. Uh, oh, please tell us what bar number you are on so we're not lost. Well, I just kind of played through the whole thing. So I just started at the top, and then I ended up repeating the last 8 bars where it went to the F chord. But so that's what this sounds like. And I'll see if I can just, since I wrote this out in Sibelius, I can just make like have the computer play it for you. Like, you can listen to it exactly in time. Um, MIDI file. Does anybody have questions about things that are happening in the solo, or any of those ideas that we talked about with the different scales? Just so Jason knows what we talked about the A minor scales, like A harmonic minor, A melodic minor, and then how to play on a dominant 7 with a flat 9, and a sharp 9. And we talked about the C harmonic major, which is kind of like how bringing in on a C scale, adding in a G sharp note really opens up like all these different chord changes, like playing on the I heard you mention. Oh, I was gonna say, uh, the adding in that G sharp note opens up to playing like the E7 chord, the G with a flat nine, the F minor because it's the minor third, the D7 with a sharp 11, the D minor 7 with a flat five, um, all those different things, which are great jazz sounds. Okay, so here's a couple comments. You say I really enjoyed the magic notes like the G sharp you talked about in the B flat and A minor. Any more tips like that working through the progression are really great nuggets. Okay. So as far as like those special notes, that one, like anytime you're on like a dominant chord, those are the types of notes that you're going for, like the third. Um, I'm getting distracted trying to read more questions as they're coming in. Let me see if I can answer this question. Uh, those magic notes, like anytime it goes to like the E7, like what I'm thinking about that makes it sound like the magic of it, like the meat of it, it's the third note in the scale and the seventh, and then also that substitution, like bringing in that flat nine sound. Another one, okay, for instance, we mentioned it before, but the augmented sound, those are really special kind of substitutions. Um, for instance, like when the tune is like at the end of the second, at the end of the first half, or at the end of the tune, you go to a G chord. You can do that augmented sound, which would be like instead of just playing like a normal G arpeggio like that, you raise that D up to an E flat, or I guess it would be a D sharp. There, I'm just doing the same pattern because that augmented pattern is a repeating interval. They're major thirds apart. Um, yeah, you bet. Let's see. Okay, what Steve, give me a little bit more context, or what did I say about searching for thirds? I don't know exactly. I think the recommendation I'm saying is that like playing the third note of whatever chord change, the third tone is really successful because it's very identifiable. Like it's what makes it sound like the chord that you're going for. Um, do you always start in first position, or do you sometimes play the whole thing out of a closed, movable position, as in 10, 11? Does that mean bars 10 to 11? Or I think I can answer that question regardless. Oh, bars 10 and 11. Yeah, like sometimes, like when I was writing this out, I was really thinking about this part of the neck. I mean, um, maybe like just another comment on like that idea. Like, do I always start out in first position, or do I go to other parts of? I mean, I don't worry about starting out on first position. Sometimes, like, I mean, maybe it's like technically second position or third position. Um, I would say, I mean, I probably don't often like start out like my solos like really like up here or something. Like there's probably like a strong sounding part of the mandolin neck that I go for, like here kind of in a mid range, kind of a middle of the neck approach, and then I save like the high things for later. But my approach for playing through chord changes is not. I mean, it's very much like movable to any positions. When I started out here in first position, but you'll notice then the only time I use that A, like right before I go to the next change, maybe I'd be see very movable because it's like that's coming from that shape we talked about. Because for me, if I've got something that's here, it's based off of those double stops and those arpeggios that we talked about. So to me, it's like, oh yeah, there's a basic C double stop, just as obvious up here. And then I've just got ways that I connect it to deal with that part of the neck. But this is like another really, I would say basic, but like important position to know. Uh, Here's this. Maybe this could be our last question. This last one that I see here from Chris. When you're playing the solo as compared to what's written, you are playing some chords sometimes like at the first D minor 7 sections. Uh-huh. Oh, yes, yes. So, my answer to this question is, on the solo that I wrote out, it just goes to like a D note. My natural inclination is to make that stronger. And like I fill in with chords all the time. So that was like a good, like, to me, like if it's going to be on a D note, you could play it open, but I like to play those types of things in a closed, fretting the note so I have more control over it. I play like there, I just played like a D chord, D minor chord, built from that as my starting point. But that could easily be like, in this context, it was like harder to get to that chord. But that's my technique that I like, my approach all the time is like if I get to a, like if I want to go to a note and then I can make a bigger chord out of it, I'm very likely to go for that bigger chord because it's part of the sound. One more thing, curious as to what are you go to connection, what are my go to connection combinations to shifting? That would be starting up like a big conversation about that. I will tell you that basically, here's last comments before we take a break because we do want to give everybody a chance to go use the bathroom or whatever, and maybe in 10 minutes we'll come back and we'll start bring Jason in. My shifting positions stuff, and I have like some YouTube videos about this and different things on my website as well, but I have this kind of whole method that developed over my lifetime of playing mandolin, where basically like the way I'm thinking about those positions as like what I call position shapes. There are those, yeah, shapes like those double stops. They're you know kind of simultaneously happening at the same time. I mean, it's a shape like a double stop or an arpeggio. Could be an arpeggio. It could be a double stop like this. It could be a double stop like this. It's all means kind of the same thing. It's like, well, that's what like that is the same you would do here. So you can think about that as a double stop with those notes, or you can think about it as a double stop with those notes. You can think about it as a double stop with those notes. So those are the types of things that I have like pretty much like if I can do it here in first position, that's how I think about it anywhere else on the neck. Like if we were in the key of A flat, for instance, this is just me starting a lick on my first finger on A flat. That's how I approach it here when it goes to A flat. And then since I'm in a different part of the neck, I have ways of dealing with that because I can actually go a fret lower and a string lower. So, but that's the same stuff I would do if I were in G. So it's like my way of treating that note when that's the one, and that's the note that I'm like building the lick around. When my second finger, I said the one, like the root note of that chord or that scale, and then when I put my second finger on it, then I have like a inherent kind of vocabulary. Like that's another shape. So I had a shape here with my finger on A flat, my first finger, and then if I shift, now my second finger is on A flat, and I have all of the associated things like what we looked at in C. Like, oh, here's when my second finger's on the root of C. So it's this. So that's kind of my way of navigating the whole neck. And then there are little different kind of specific moves that pop up that are like unique to every key. But so much of like what you're doing is kind of universal to all the keys. It's like, but maybe you just like move it up a fret or something. Okay, let's take I'm gonna say like a 5-minute break. And Jason, feel free to unmute, and we'll just, I mean, I'm assuming you're connected and you probably have your set up and ready to go, but everybody else
Hey.
can take a break. And I'm actually going to stop recording because I'm going to record for the next part of the workshop.